I took the ring off her finger right there in front of all 247 guests. My hand wasn't even shaking. 3 years of planning this wedding, and it ended in the time it takes to pour a cup of coffee. My future mother-in-law was screaming at me. My fiancée was crying these big theatrical tears that I'd seen before, the ones she used when she wanted something from her father. The string quartet had stopped playing. My own father was sitting in his wheelchair at the front row, his hands folded in his lap, that quiet dignity he'd carried his whole life, still intact even after what she'd just said about him. And the funny thing is, I wasn't angry. Not yet. The anger came later that night, when I was alone in my truck driving back to the cabin. What I felt standing there at the altar was something colder than that, something like clarity. But let me back up. My name is Walter Hammond. I'm 58 years old, and I live just outside of Bozeman, Montana. I run a small contracting business, nothing fancy, mostly residential work, the occasional barn or outbuilding for the ranches up in the Gallatin Valley. My father, Earl Hammond, is 83 years old. He worked his whole life as a long-haul trucker, drove rigs from Seattle to Miami and everywhere in between for 46 years. Got his back blown out by a drunk driver in '04 outside of Cheyenne. Now he uses a wheelchair on bad days and a walker on good ones. My mother passed when I was 19, ovarian cancer, quick and brutal. My father raised me alone after that. Well, raised the man I already mostly was, since I was already in junior college by then. He never remarried. Used to say, my mother was the only good thing that ever happened to him besides me, and he didn't see the point in trying to top that. I met Caroline 3 years ago at a charity auction in downtown Bozeman. She was 38, 10 years younger than me, and she worked as a regional director for some financial services firm that had offices in Seattle and Denver. Beautiful woman. Tall, dark hair, the kind of laugh that made you feel like you'd said something smarter than you actually had. Her family was old money out of Connecticut originally, though her parents had relocated to Jackson Hole about 15 years back. Her father, Richard Pemberton, was some retired hedge fund guy. Her mother, Vivian, ran charity boards and threw parties. I knew from the start we came from different worlds. I made a fine living, comfortable, but my hands had calluses, and I drove a 2014 Ford F-250 with 180,000 miles on it. Caroline drove a Range Rover that cost more than my first house. But she told me more than once that she loved how grounded I was, how real, how tired she was of men who'd never done a day of honest work. I believed her. That's the part that still stings even now. I believed her. That Sistua stings even now. I should have seen it sooner. There were signs, looking back, the way she got quiet when I'd mentioned my father, the way she always had a reason why she couldn't come up to visit him at his place in Belgrade, the way she'd asked me, very casually, about 6 months into our engagement, whether my father had a long-term care plan in place, and whether I was exposed to his medical expenses. I told her my father had savings. I told her the truth, which was that he'd been frugal his whole life, that he owned his little ranch house outright, and that I helped him when he needed it. But he was largely independent. I told her my father was the proudest man I knew, and would rather die than ask anyone for a dime he hadn't earned. She'd nodded and changed the subject. I thought it was love and concern. I know now it was assessment. The wedding was supposed to be a small affair. That's what I'd wanted, maybe 60 people out at a friend's property near Big Sky. Caroline had agreed. Then her mother got involved. Then her father got involved. Then suddenly, we had 247 confirmed guests at the Pemberton family estate in Jackson Hole, a wedding planner who charged more than I paid my whole crew in a year, and a guest list that included 2 state senators, a former cabinet member, and 3 people whose last names I recognized from financial news. I'd swallowed all of it, because she said this was important to her parents, and her parents had paid for everything, and I figured, what did I care about the venue? The marriage was what mattered. That's what I told myself. My father didn't want to come. He told me that, plain, about a month out. He said, "Son, those people don't want me at their party. They want you, but they don't want me." I told him he was being stubborn. I told him he was my father, and he was going to walk me down the aisle, or roll me, or whatever he needed to do, because there was no version of this day where he wasn't there. He looked at me for a long time. Then he said, "All right, Walt. All right." And that was that. The morning of the wedding, I picked him up at his house. He was wearing the suit I'd bought him the week before. He'd had his hair cut, a real haircut at a barber shop instead of the kitchen chair trim he usually gave himself. He smelled like the same Old Spice aftershave he'd worn my entire life. I hadn't realized until I saw him that morning how much I needed him there. I bent down and hugged him in his chair, and I felt him pat my back the way he used to when I was a boy. "Look at you," he said. "Look at my boy." We drove down to Jackson together. He was nervous, I could tell. He kept smoothing the lapel of his jacket. He asked me twice if his tie was straight. I told him he looked sharp. I told him my mother would have been proud. He got quiet after that, looking out the window at the mountains. The ceremony went fine. He rolled beside me down the aisle, his hand on my arm, and when we got to the front, he reached up and squeezed my shoulder and whispered, "Your mother's watching, son." Caroline came down the aisle on her father's arm, looking like she'd stepped out of a magazine. I said my vows. She said hers. I kissed her. People clapped. I felt like a man who had finally arrived somewhere good. The reception is where it all came apart. We did the receiving line in the great hall, long room with white marble floors and crystal chandeliers and French doors opening onto a stone terrace that looked out at the Tetons. Caroline and I stood at the head of the line. My father had positioned his wheelchair a few feet behind us, where he could see everyone come through. He'd been holding up beautifully. Tired, you could tell, but holding up. About 30 minutes into the receiving line, Caroline's mother brought over a couple I didn't recognize. The man was wearing what I later learned was a $14,000 watch. The woman had on a dress that probably cost more than my father's medications for a year. Vivian made introductions. The husband was something at a private equity firm. The wife sat on the board of 2 museums. "Lovely to meet you. Lovely to meet you. Lovely to meet you." And then Vivian gestured toward my father and said, with this little laugh, and of course, Walter's father. He drove trucks. Like that was the whole biography. Like that was all you needed to know. My father held out his hand to the couple. The husband shook it, perfectly polite. The wife sort of nodded and pulled her hand back close to her body. Caroline laughed. It was a small laugh, almost under her breath, but I heard it. And then, loud enough for the people around us to hear, she said to her mother, "Mom, can we please move him? He smells like the inside of a Peterbilt. I don't want our pictures ruined." The conversations around us didn't stop exactly. They got quieter. People nearby had heard her. I watched the woman in the expensive dress look down at her shoes. I watched the man with the watch find something fascinating about the chandelier. I looked at my father. He was still smiling. He was still holding his hand out. Slightly, like he hadn't realized yet that the moment had passed. And then I saw the moment he did realize. I saw the smile stay on his face, but the light go out of his eyes. I'd seen that look before, only once, the day my mother died. I saw a man absorb something terrible and decide to keep his composure, because that's what he'd always done. I turned to Caroline. I said very quietly, "What did you just say?" She rolled her eyes. She actually rolled her eyes at me. "Walter, don't be dramatic. I just meant, what did you say?" Her mother put a hand on my arm. "Walter, sweetheart, she didn't mean." I took my mother-in-law's hand off my arm. I did it gently. I'm not a man who touches women in anger, but I removed her hand and I set it back at her side and I said, "Vivian, please don't touch me." The room was quiet now. Really quiet. The string quartet was still playing in the next room, but in our room, you could hear forks on plates. Caroline finally seemed to understand that something was wrong. She put on her wounded face, the theatrical one. "Walter, my God, I was joking. Can you please not make a scene at our wedding? My father has invested so much in this day. I'll never forget that sentence. My father has invested so much in this day." Like the day was a portfolio. I looked at her. I looked at this woman I had loved for 3 years. This woman I had loved for 3 years. This woman I had just promised my life to. And I felt the strangest thing. I felt nothing. The love had drained out of me in the space of about 90 seconds. I knew, the way you know it's about to rain, that I was looking at a stranger. I reached down and I took her left hand. I slid the ring off her finger. She let me. She was so surprised she let me. "Walter, what are you doing?" I put the ring in my jacket pocket. I turned to the room. I said, "I'd like to thank everyone for coming. I'd like to apologize for the inconvenience of the journey. There isn't going to be a marriage." Somebody gasped. Vivian started to say something. Richard, Caroline's father, came pushing through the crowd, his face purple. "Walter, you don't get to, Mr. Pemberton," I said. "I'd like you to take a step back from me, sir." Something in my voice stopped him. He stopped. I walked back to my father. I crouched down in front of his wheelchair. He was looking at me with this expression I can't really describe. Surprise, maybe. Or pride. Or just love. The way he'd looked at me when I was 6 years old and brought him a frog I'd caught in the creek. "Dad," I said, "we're leaving." "Walt, you don't have to." "Yes, I do." "We're leaving." "Walt, you don't have to." "Yes, I do. We're leaving." I wheeled him out of that great hall, past the open mouths, past the cameras some idiot was still recording with, past Caroline's parents who had finally remembered they had a voice and were using it to call after me. I wheeled my father out to the valet stand, and I asked a kid in a red vest to bring my truck around. I lifted my father into the passenger seat, the way I'd done 1,000 times. I folded up his wheelchair and put it in the bed of the truck, and we drove away. Neither one of us said anything for the first 20 minutes. He was looking out the window. I was just driving. Then he reached over and put his hand on my knee, the way he used to when I was a boy and we'd drive out to fish on Saturday mornings. He said, "I'm sorry, son. I almost ran off the road. Dad, what are you sorry for? I should have stayed home. I knew, and I should have stayed home. I had to pull over. I pulled onto the shoulder of Highway 191, and I'd put the truck in park, and I sat there with my hands on the wheel. I didn't want him to see me cry. He's 83 years old, and he's been through enough in his life, and he didn't need to see his son fall apart on the side of a highway. But he saw. Of course he saw. Of course he saw. He put his hand on the back of my neck the way he had when I was a child. He didn't say anything. He just kept his hand there. After a while, I was able to drive again. Here is the part you need to understand. I didn't plan revenge. I want to be clear about that. I'm not the kind of man who plans revenge. I'm a contractor. I build things. I fix things. I have spent my entire adult life trying to be a person my father could be proud of, and revenge has never been part of that picture. But 2 days later, my lawyer called me. His name is Tom Eccleston. He's been my family lawyer for 30 years. He handled my mother's estate. He handled my father's settlement after the trucking accident. He'd handled the prenuptial agreement. That's right, there was a prenup. Caroline's family had insisted. They'd insisted on a prenup that protected Caroline's family assets in the event of a divorce, and they'd had Tom draft a corresponding clause protecting mine, more or less for symmetry, because frankly I didn't have much that needed protecting compared to them. Or so I'd thought. Tom called me on a Tuesday morning. He said, "Walter, I need you to come into the office today. There's something you need to see." I drove up to Bozeman. Tom is a careful man. He's not a dramatic man. When he sits you down across his desk and pours you a coffee without asking, you know something is about to happen. He said, "Walter, did you know that Richard Pemberton's investment firm has been quietly trying to acquire mineral rights in eastern Montana for the last 14 months? I said I didn't. He said, "Did you know that the largest single block of mineral rights they've been trying to acquire is held by an estate that belongs to your father?" I stared at him. You have to understand something about my father. After my mother died, after he got back on the road, he started buying small parcels of land out east, near Sydney and Glendive, in the back country. Nothing big. He'd take a load out to North Dakota, And on the way back, he'd talk to ranchers and farmers, and he'd buy little pieces of bottomland for almost nothing. He did this for 20 years. He never made a big deal of it. He just said it was something to leave to me one day. I knew about the land. I'd been out there with him. It was scrub and sage and not much else as far as I could see. What I hadn't known, what he hadn't known either until about 3 years ago, was that he'd accidentally accumulated a contiguous block of about 4,800 acres sitting on top of one of the more productive parts of the Bakken Formation. 3 years ago, a landman had shown up at his house with an offer. My father had said no. Another offer had come. He'd said no again. He told me about it, once, almost in passing. He said he didn't want oil men tearing up land he'd bought with the idea of leaving me somewhere quiet to go when I was old. I told him to do what felt right. Tom slid a folder across the desk. He said, "The current standing offer on your father's parcel from Pemberton Resources Holdings is $18.2 million. That offer has been on the table for 10 months. Your father has not responded." I looked at the folder. I looked at Tom. "Walter," he said, "I'm telling you this because there's something else you need to know. About 6 months ago, Caroline came to see me. Without you. She was asking in very general terms what your father's estate would look like if something were to happen to him. She wanted to understand how your prenup would interact with your inheritance." I sat there for a long time. Tom said, "I didn't tell her anything. There was nothing to tell legally, but Walter, I had a bad feeling. I went and I did some digging. Pemberton Resources is owned by a holding company in Delaware. That holding company is owned in part by a trust. Caroline is a named beneficiary of that trust." My hands felt cold. "She knew," I said. "She knew enough. She knew her father's firm was trying to acquire a major parcel from a Montana family. She knew the family's name was Hammond. I can't prove she came after you on purpose, Walter, but I can tell you that the chances of her bumping into you at a charity auction by random luck, given the position of her family's firm relative to your father's holdings, are not good chances." I drove home from Tom's office in a kind of fog. I went out to my father's house in Belgrade. He was sitting on the porch the way he always was on a nice afternoon. He looked up at me and I think he could tell something had happened. I sat down on the step in front of him. I told him what Tom had told me. He listened without interrupting. When I was done, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Walt, that woman, the one at the wedding, the one who said what she said, she knew about the land. I think she knew her father wanted it. I don't know if she knew exactly what it was." He nodded slowly. He looked out at the field across from his porch. He said, "Your mother used to say that there are two kinds of people in this world, people who see other people, and people who see what other people can do for them. She said you could tell the difference if you watched long enough. She said the first kind would always treat the waiter the same as the senator. The second kind would smile at the senator and ignore the waiter." He looked back at me. That woman saw a waiter. I didn't sleep much that week. I kept thinking about 3 years of my life. 3 years of dinners, of trips, of conversations, of plans. I kept thinking about how she'd asked about my father's medical exposure. I kept thinking about how she'd never wanted to visit him. I kept thinking about how she'd laughed, just laughed, when her mother announced him as the man who drove trucks. I called Tom back the following Monday. I told him I wanted to do 2 things. The first thing was about the prenup. The prenup had a clause, standard one, about misrepresentation. If either party had entered the marriage under materially false pretenses, the agreement could be challenged. We hadn't gotten to a marriage, technically. The officiant hadn't signed and filed the license. But there were other agreements that had been signed and exchanged. Vivian's family had paid for the wedding, almost $1 million worth. They had also, as part of the prenup negotiation, transferred a parcel of land in Jackson Hole into joint ownership with me, as a sort of wedding gift that was supposed to vest after 1 year of marriage. It was worth about $2.3 million. Their lawyers had structured it in a way that would have given Caroline a clean way back out if the marriage didn't last. Standard rich family stuff. But because the marriage hadn't happened, and because there was now reason to believe the engagement had been entered under false pretenses, that land was sitting in a kind of legal grey zone. Tom thought we had a strong case to have it transferred fully to me, not because I wanted Jackson Hole real estate. I didn't, but because I wanted them to know what it cost to do what they had done. The second thing was about my father's land. I called him that night and asked him what he wanted to do. He thought about it for a few days. Then he called me back. He said, "Son, I don't want oil men on my land. I never have. But I also don't want to make a mistake here. Come out and let's talk." I drove out to Belgrade. We sat on his porch. He said, "If we sell to anyone, it's not going to be Pemberton. That's settled. Anyone but him. But I've been thinking. I'm an old man, Walt. That land was always for you, not for me. If we sell it, the money's yours. And I want you to do something with it that means something, not just put it in a bank." I asked him what he had in mind. He said, "Your mother used to volunteer at the women's shelter in Bozeman. She wanted to start a fund for women who needed to get out of bad situations. She never got the chance. I've thought about her dream every day for 40 years. What I'd like, Walt, if you'd be willing, is to take some of that money and start the thing she didn't get to start." I sat on that porch and I cried like a child. We did sell the land. Not to Pemberton. We sold it to a competing firm out of Houston for $19.4 million, with a clause that the surface use would be minimal and that local hires would be prioritized. My father took $1 million for himself, which I had to argue him into for 2 weeks. He used part of it to buy a slightly nicer wheelchair-accessible truck so he could ride along when I went out on jobs. The rest he put in trust. The remaining $18 million plus some after taxes became the Margaret Hammond Foundation, named for my mother. We have funded shelters in 4 states. We have funded transitional housing in 12. We have paid for the legal fees of women fleeing abusive marriages. We have paid for daycare so women could go back to school. We do not advertise. My father insisted on that. He said, "Your mother wouldn't have wanted a parade. She would have wanted the work." About 6 months after the wedding, the news about the foundation got out. Just a small piece in a Montana paper. A local reporter who'd noticed the funding showing up at a shelter and traced it back. I got a phone call the next week. Caroline. The first time I'd heard her voice since the day I'd taken the ring back. She wanted to meet for coffee. She wanted to talk. She said she'd made mistakes. She said her family had pressured her, that she hadn't understood, that her parents had been planning things she hadn't been part of. I let her talk. When she was done, I said, "Caroline, the thing you said about my father, did your mother put those words in your mouth?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "No." "Did your father?" "No." "Did your words?" "Walter, I was nervous. Those were your words, Caroline. And I want you to understand something. I don't hate you. I don't have the energy. But I want you to know that the man you called a peasant, the man you said smelled like a truck, that man drove a rig for 46 years to put food on the table and to put me through school and to keep his wife in chemotherapy for as long as she had to fight. That man is the reason there is now a foundation in my mother's name, helping women get out of homes that aren't safe. You and your father wanted his land. You ended up paying for the foundation that bears my mother's name. I think God has a sense of humor about these things." She didn't say anything. I said, "Take care of yourself, Caroline. I mean that. Goodbye." I never heard from her again. Her father's firm did not, in the end, acquire the back and parcel they had needed for some larger deal. I'm told it cost them quite a bit. I don't know the details, and I don't care to know them. The land in Jackson Hole eventually came to me in a settlement. I sold it to a conservation trust at cost, and the proceeds went to the foundation. My father is 83. He sits on the board of the foundation. He shows up to every meeting, even the ones over Zoom, that he doesn't understand. He calls every executive director by their first name and asks about their families. The women who run our shelters love him. He brings them cookies when he visits in person, the kind my mother used to make, oatmeal raisin, baked from her recipe by a neighbor lady who lives down the road from him. I haven't remarried. I'm not in a hurry. My father told me once, sitting on his porch, that he thought I would know the right woman when she came along because she would see him, really see him, and treat him the way my mother would have treated him. I think he's right. I'm not looking. If she shows up, she shows up. I think about that day at the Pemberton estate sometimes. I think about the moment Caroline laughed under her breath. I think about my father's face. I think about the man with the expensive watch looking at the chandelier. People talk a lot about what wealth is. I had 3 years to be told what wealth was by people who had a lot of it. They thought wealth was the dress, the watch, the chandelier, the senators, the Tetons out the window. They thought wealth was something you could measure. My father has lived in the same small house in Belgrade for 41 years. He drives the same truck he bought 5 years ago. He still uses the same coffee mug he was using the morning my mother died. He is the wealthiest man I have ever known, and I think the difference between him and the people in that great hall is something they will never understand, no matter how many parcels of land they buy. I wheel him out onto the porch every Sunday afternoon when I come over for dinner. We watch the light come down off the bridges. He tells me stories I have heard 1,000 times. I listen like it's the first time. He is my father. He smells like Old Spice and motor oil and the inside of an honest life. And there is no woman alive who is worth pretending otherwise. That's the whole story. That's everything. I have thought about that day at the Pemberton estate more times than I can count. Not because I miss Caroline. I don't. I have thought about it because I keep trying to understand how a person who seemed so kind for 3 years could say what she said in less than 10 seconds. And the answer I keep coming back to is the simplest one. She didn't change. I just finally saw her. My father told me something once, years before any of this happened. He said a man's character is not what he shows you when things are easy. A man's character is what comes out of his mouth when he forgets you're watching. Caroline forgot, for about 90 seconds at that reception, that I was watching her the way a husband watches a wife. She thought I was already a thing she owned. She thought my father was a problem to be managed. And in that small window of forgetting, she told me everything I needed to know about the next 40 years of my life if I had stayed. I think about cause and effect. Every choice she made, going back 3 years, was building toward that moment, whether she knew it or not. The questions about my father's medical exposure, the reasons she never came to visit him, the way her eyes drifted past him at every family dinner. Those weren't accidents. Those were the early frames of the same movie that ended at the receiving line. And every choice I made, going back to my own childhood, was building toward the moment I took that ring off her finger. My father taught me how to recognize a man's worth. He taught me by example, not by lecture. He drove a rig for 46 years so I could go to school. He sat by my mother's bed for 14 months while she died. He never once asked anyone to feel sorry for him. When the moment came, when I had to choose between a beautiful woman and the old man in the wheelchair behind me, the choice was already made. It was made by every Saturday morning he took me fishing. It was made by every birthday he worked overtime to afford. I didn't have to think. The thing I want any younger man hearing this to understand is that real strength isn't loud. Real strength is the quiet man in the chair behind you who never asked you to be anything except honest. Real intelligence isn't a degree or a title or a watch. Real intelligence is the ability to tell the difference between someone who sees you and someone who sees what you can do for them. And real character is what you do in the 90 seconds when nobody thinks you'll stand up. I lost a fiancé that day. I gained back my own self-respect, which I hadn't realized I'd been slowly trading away for 3 years. I gained a foundation in my mother's name that has helped almost 2,000 women so far. I gained more evenings on my father's porch than I would have had otherwise, because the woman I almost married would have kept me too busy to visit him. Every loss of my life that I have looked at honestly has turned out, eventually, to be a gift in worse handwriting. This one was no exception, and I sleep just fine.